Right, hi everyone. Sorry about the technical difficulties. My name's Amrik, and I'm just into the first year, just completed the first year of my full-time PhD at Bournemouth. My email is there at the bottom in the middle in blue, if you have any questions afterwards. I'm lucky to have a great supervision team under Jane Healy, Dr. Jane Healy, and Dr. Jane Caldwell, and just recently Dr. Ferhat Tura. I've just kind of playing around with the title, and I think I finally got it right. And I think that helps a lot when you got the title right, because the title now does what it says on the tin. It is an exploration to try and determine what might be the main factor that is contributing to low guilty verdict rates in transphobic hate crimes, and what would be the impact of LGBT representative mock juries on these factors. So if we could have the next slide, please, Leah. Some background. So under the current hate crime laws, there are 5 protected identities, namely race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, and transgender. But they're not equally protected. There's a 2-tier system. Under tier 1, race and religion are protected such that if there's a racially or religiously motivated hate crime, then it carries a much higher sentence, a considerably higher sentence, disproportional. And under tier 2, for gender, sexuality, and disability characteristics, there's a sentence enhancement applied by the judge. And that sentence enhancement takes into account the fact that it is a hate crime and there's extra harm done to the victim and to society. But that sentence enhancement must be within the limit of the maximum sentence for the base offense. Now, for common assault, that would be within 6 months. The maximum sentence it could be increased to is 6 months. Whereas if it was aggravated, then it would be 2 years. 10 years ago, the government asked the Law Commission to look into how maybe we could achieve equality. Rather than having a 2-tier system, could we have a single system where all 5 identities, race, religion, sexual orientation, disability, and transgender are treated equally under the law? And just recently, 10 years later, the Law Commission has kind of recommended in 2020, and again in 2022, that aggravated offences be extended to the characteristics of transgender, sexuality, and disability. However, the problem was that they didn't really address the criticisms and complexities that come along with aggravated offences, and we'll have a look at those in a bit. The next slide, please. So the first problem is that if we look at real cases, not mock jury studies, but real cases, we see that there's a significantly lower conviction rate for aggravated offences compared to their base offence. So aggravated, racially or religiously aggravated assault, 51% conviction rate compared to 85% if it was just for assault. And in terms of criminal damage, 58% compared to 79%. So more than 50% difference in the conviction rates. This research employs mock jury methods to try and explore the problems and to test a solution, because it does embrace a philosophy of pragmatism. And pragmatism is centered around solution-focused research, testing what might work, what can help. So, but what's a mock jury study? A mock jury study is where participants are asked to imagine that they are a member of a jury, and they are given a brief summary of the statements from the defendant and the alleged victim or complainant, and maybe other witness statements, and asked to decide on a verdict. You might think, well, okay, it doesn't sound very authentic, but if we compare this to real juries, just this year, Anwar and Halmarson did a study comparing English and American juries with mock American and English juries with real juries, i.e. they were able to get permission of a judge for these juries to sit as shadow juries and go through the cases as if they were members of the jury and decide on verdicts. And all they found was that in 12 criminal trials, there was a slight difference in that the English mock juries tended to give slightly more guilty verdicts. In fact, they were exactly equal to the guilty verdicts given by the judge in all 12 cases. Just last year, the UK piloted via justice possibility of having online juries using mock jurors. And their conclusion was that they should use online juries in real cases and that this should be extended nationwide to help reduce the backlogs. And the backlog of cases for the Crown Courts is at its highest level that it's ever been. Also, other field studies involving shadow mock juries and analysis of archives of real jury trials has shown similar decisions and similar biases by jurors to those made by mock jurors. So it gives quite good credibility to mock jury studies. Could we have the next slide, please, Leah? So separately, mock jury studies have shown that there's 4 main reasons why we can maybe expect low conviction rates and why these have been evidenced. The first reason is juror bias. So jurors are members of the public. They may have certain biases towards a victim's characteristic, towards their sexual orientation or gender. Jurors also tend to exhibit acquittal bias. The higher the sentence, the more likely they are to give a not guilty verdict. The third factor is the jury foreperson. This is important because the jury foreperson, there's no set way in how the jury foreperson should be chosen and by whom. Sometimes the judge will choose the jury foreperson and sometimes the jury will, but it tends to be male heterosexual with previous jury experience where possible, somebody of high social economic status who's quickly chosen usually by the judge. The fourth factor that can contribute to low conviction rates is lack of clarity in juridic instructions. So jurors have often said afterwards that they didn't quite understand this or they weren't sure about that. And the law can be quite confusing when they're told, well, you know, if just prior to or at the time of committing the offense or just afterwards, there's no clarity on how long before or how long after, if they had said a transphobic slur and threatened the victim, what time frame are we talking about? What does it mean just before or just after? It can be a couple of days. Some judges have interpreted this as meaning several days. So there doesn't seem to be clarity about, okay, does it count as a transphobic slur when it's said in anger, when the defendant is provoked, or if it's deemed to be common language? So this research will try to determine the main factors that contribute to low guilty verdict rates in transphobic aggravated hate crimes. We know they're about 50% lower than their base offences, and it will try to determine what's the impact of LGBT representative mock juries on these factors. Do they help to give more fairer verdicts? So the overarching research question is, in transphobic hate crimes, are guilty verdict rates higher in LGBT representative mock juries compared to non-LGBT representative mock juries? Can we have the next slide, please, Leah? Thank you. So this table shows some of the different stigmatized characteristics that have been evidenced by researchers to show that mock jurors tend to bias their verdicts according to the victim or defendant's race, according to the victim's gender, sexuality, religion, and there's extra legal factors. The important thing about race, gender, sexuality, i.e. all the 5 protected characteristics, mock jurors and real jury archive records have shown that there is bias towards these characteristics, and that can cause lower conviction rates. Extra legal factors are factors that jurors should not be taking into consideration, but they do tend to take it into consideration, especially when cases are kind of borderline, there's not very strong evidence, and this is when other factors like the jury foreperson's opinion comes in, the severity of the sentence comes in, and also whether they understood the instructions, the jury instructions clearly. So this is a slightly older version, but we'll go to the next slide now, please. So what's a possible solution? We're coming at it from a pragmatic point of view, so we need to focus on what could help. Possible solution to reducing juror stigma towards transgender victims and defendants, because transgender people are overly represented in prisons and in the criminal justice system. So having more LGBT representative juries could be the answer, because first of all, rightly, they should be gender representative anyway by law. So secondary transfer effects of intergroup contact could help reduce trans prejudice. This is where for example, Hofarth and Hodgson showed that contact with gay individuals by secondary transfer actually reduced prejudice towards transgender people and increased the support that people gave to transgender rights and civic rights, which had a lasting effect beyond the study. Intergroup contacts also been shown in meta-analyses by Pettigrew and Trop, both in 2005 and again in 2013, to be the most effective prejudice reduction intervention that there is out there at the moment. An imagined contact is a type of contact where participants have simply been asked to imagine that they are having a brief positive interaction with an out-group member. And it's been shown to be just as effective as direct contact. There's other types of contact as well, like vicarious contact and extended contact, but we will be using imagined contact in this study. There's evidence, as I mentioned, of lasting effects of imagined contact. Several researchers have shown where the effects have, in longitudinal studies, been maintained for 7 months, and some researchers recently for more than a year. So imagined contact can be considered as a simple strategy to try and simulate an LGBT representative mock jury. Otherwise, it can get ethically difficult to recruit mock jurors from the LGBT community and expose them to the kind of deliberations that we don't know what they could expect. And through an imagined jury, we can test the impact of reducing bias towards transgender victims, and in turn its impact on guilty verdict rates. Yeah, if we could have the next slide, please. So the other problem is that the Law Commission themselves, very briefly in their 550-page consultation paper, their actual report, in 2020, mentioned very briefly that the sentence lengths for base offences, or rather for aggravated offences, were kind of disproportional. I would say they're extremely disproportional, but they're totally unnecessary. So if we look at the actual sentences given in 2018, for example, for common assault, the average sentence given was 2.8 months. The maximum sentence that they could have given was 6 months, but the average sentence given was 2.8 months. And for the aggravated common assault, it's just 3.7 months. It just varies by 3 or 4 weeks. Could have been 2 years. So it doesn't seem that you would need sentence maxima for aggravated offences of 2 years, where no sentence has been given above. For aggravated offences, there's no sentence given by a judge in the last year that exceeded 6 months. So, and if you average the total for all the 11 offences, the average sentence for the base offence was higher than that for aggravated offences. So why have such disproportional and unnecessarily high sentence maxima? Because, as we'll see in the next slide, why is it a problem if sentences are disproportionate and or unnecessarily high? If they're too high, they can lead to acquittal bias, i.e. the higher the maximum sentence, the fewer the guilty verdicts. So this research will explore if there is any evidence of acquittal bias. How can we explore that? Well, there's only a handful of reasons why jurors may give a not guilty verdict. They may believe the defendant more than the victim. They may consider that there's not enough evidence. They may blame the victim more than the defendant. They may stigmatize the victim's identity, or they may consider the sentence to be too severe, or something else. But what we can do, we can simply ask mock jurors, what is the main reason for their verdict? It's amazing how many mock jury studies don't ask this, but a few do. And we can compare the guilty verdict rates when the maximum sentence is described as 2 years and when it's described as 1 year. We can also do that to determine, is acquittal bias significantly lower in LGBT representative mock juries, or when mock jurors are informed the sentence maxima is 2 years compared to 1 year. Could we have the next slide, please? So the third problem, as I mentioned earlier, was the jury foreperson, because they typically tend to be heterosexual male in 80% of trials, of high social economic status, usually somebody who has previous jury experience. Why is that a problem? Well, it further marginalizes homosexual people. It also means that this is important where the jury foreperson has been shown to have significantly more influence on other jurors' verdicts than other jurors. So if you end up with a pro-defendant jury foreman, it could be a big problem for a victim, because they will have more influence on the rest of the jury than other jurors. So this research will test the impact of whether this extra influence of the jury foreman when they're pro-defendant can be negated in an LGBT representative mock jury due to the secondary transfer effects of imagined contact. Remember, contact with gay individuals has been shown to reduce prejudice towards transgender people. If we could have the next slide, please, Leah. So the last problem, problem 4, they're all interrelated, these problems. So, and this is very specific. This was brought up by the Law Commission very briefly, again, in their 550-page report, but they did remark that some of the stakeholders, the CPS and defense counsellors were concerned that jurors and other court officials tend to interpret some slurs, some derogatory language as acceptable because it may be considered common language, or when it's said in anger. These are the, I've got a spelling error there, but so when it's said in anger, do we overlook it and not count it as a transphobic slur, or when the defendant was provoked? So this research, again, it will ask mock jurors, to what extent do you agree or disagree with the following statements. Calling a transgender person, and I've deleted out the unnecessary slurs there. So because it may be considered normal language, or because it was said in anger, or because the defendant felt provoked. And the other thing that has got a lot of defendants off is when they have produced a witness with the identity that they are being accused of having hostility towards. So if they produce a transgender friend and they say, look, this is my friend, so this proves that I do not hate, or I'm not hostile towards transgender people. This has also been kind of confused jurors, and where they kind of opted for, well, that kind of, they've been more satisfied that it does prove that. And it would be important to know how many jurors think this, because this was one of the concerns that the Law Commission raised themselves. Could we have the next slide, please, Leah? The other thing that I want to do in this research is that when you read mock jury studies, it always pertains to mock juror bias towards the victim's race or the victim's gender or sexuality. And it never puts it in terms of institutional stigma. This is, to me, it's institutional stigma, because let's have a look at what the definition is first. Hudson-Buller says it's an unjust law or policy or practice or cultural norm that denies or fails to protect the equal rights of minorities. If it does that, it's evidence of institutional stigma. Now, the jury foreperson is, the practice is, it's an unjust practice that which denies or fails to protect the equal rights of minorities to being selected as the jury foreperson in 80% of cases, or ensuring that the jury foreperson does not have more influence than other jurors. All jurors should have the same influence. The jury foreperson tends to take up 30 to 40% of jury deliberation times as well. When you got sentence severity being disproportionate, unnecessary, then I would say that's an unjust law. It's an unjust law because it denies or fails to protect the equal rights of minorities to fair conviction rates. And in doing so, it is institutional stigma. The fact that the government still only uses the electoral register to select people for jury service is also an unjust policy, because it denies, again, and fails to protect the equal rights of minorities to being selected for jury service. A lot of LGBT people, there's higher levels of homelessness, so they are less likely to be on electoral registers. A lot of countries use more than one register. They may use vehicle tax and vehicle licensing registers. They may use benefit registers in combination. We're one of the few countries that only relies on the electoral register. And as a consequence of that, recent research has shown that UK juries are LGBT underrepresented. They are minority underrepresented. Again, this is institutional stigma. This is a slightly older version, but we'll go to the next slide, please, Leah. Oh, okay. So I'll fill in the slide that's missing. It's a mixed methods study, and one of the most important things, if not the most important thing, is to hear the voices or give voices to LGBT people who have real experiences of jury service. And so what was the experience of how the jury foreman was selected? How was their opinion? How did they find other jurors reacted towards their opinions? Did they feel like they were an equal part of the jury deliberations? So for that reason, there'll be 6 structured interviews with LGBT people that have real experience of jury service to compare some of their real experiences with what we find quantitatively. And I think that's it, because
thank you. Let me stop the recording.